What if the cruelty was the policy, not the exception? Not the scandal quietly buried in court filings or whispered about in reform circles. The codified, legislated, taxpayer-funded punishment that happens in plain sight. From forcing women to give birth in shackles to charging inmates for the privilege of reading their own court documents. These aren't anomalies. They're not the result of bad apples or underfunded systems gone rogue. They're written into law, approved by legislatures, and upheld by courts. For decades, the United States has built a carceral system where the punishment doesn't end at incarceration. It extends into every corner of an inmate's existence, extracting profit, denying dignity, and ensuring that punishment becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. Today, we're walking through the legal framework of that cruelty. Welcome to 25 disgusting prison policies that are completely legal. Before we step inside these legal loopholes and legislative nightmares, if you're drawn to the kind of truth that makes systems uncomfortable, hit subscribe and stay vigilant with us. While you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And have you or someone you know ever been caught in the machinery we're about to dissect? We're not here to judge your story. We're here to judge the system that created it. Let's begin. 1. Pay-to-stay jail fees. There's a certain dark poetry to charging someone for their own imprisonment. Not as metaphor, not as satire, whispered in think pieces about late-stage capitalism, but as actual policy, typed into municipal codes and enforced by collection agencies with the same enthusiasm they'd pursue unpaid credit card debt. In 43 states across the country, counties have decided that incarceration isn't just punishment. It's a billable service, a bed and breakfast situation, except you can't check out. The breakfast is inedible, and the bill arrives whether you're convicted or not. The fees are called pay-to-stay, room and board charges, or simply booking fees. The language varies by jurisdiction, but the mechanism is the same. From the moment you enter a county jail, the meter starts running. $20 a day in some places, $50 in others. Some counties in California charge upwards of $150 per night. The daily rate gets logged into a ledger. The days accumulate, and by the time you're released, whether you've been found guilty, taken a plea, or had your charges dropped entirely, you owe the county, sometimes thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands. For years, officials defended this practice as cost recovery. Jails are expensive to operate, they said. Taxpayers shouldn't bear the entire burden. If you're the one occupying the cell, you should contribute. It sounded almost reasonable, framed that way. Almost like user fees for a public service, no different than tolls on a highway or entry fees at a national park. Except highways don't lock you inside. And national parks don't bill you if you're later proven innocent of trespassing. The justification crumbled under scrutiny, but the policy remained. Because what county officials didn't mention, at least not in public hearings, was that these fees created a beautifully perverse incentive structure. Every person booked into jail became a revenue stream. Every bed filled was a line item in the budget. And the longer someone stayed, pretrial detention stretching from days into weeks into months, the larger the bill grew. It wasn't about cost recovery. It was about profit extraction from a captive population with zero negotiating power. It turns out that the people most likely to be charged these fees are also the least likely to ever pay them. They're poor. That's often why they're in jail in the first place. Can't afford bail, can't afford a private attorney, can't afford to miss work while fighting charges. So they sit, and the county charges them for sitting. And when they're finally released, they walk out with debt that follows them like a shadow. A debt that shows up on credit reports, that blocks them from renting apartments, that gets garnished from paychecks they're struggling to earn in the first place. In Riverside County, California, a man spent 2 years in pretrial detention. The charges were eventually dropped. He walked out of jail legally innocent and $12,000 in debt to the county that had caged him. The county sent the bill to collections. In Macomb County, Michigan, Another man was acquitted after 8 months of detention. He owed nearly $8,000. When he couldn't pay, the county sued him. These aren't outliers. They're the system functioning exactly as designed. The math is simple and devastating. If you earn minimum wage, which many formerly incarcerated people do, and a quarter of your paycheck is garnished for jail debt, you're starting life after incarceration in a hole you didn't dig. You can't save for an apartment. You can't rebuild credit. You can't stabilize. And when instability leads to missed court dates, technical violations, or the kind of survival crimes that poverty breeds, you end up back inside, where the county starts billing you again. What makes this grotesque is not just the practice itself, but the legal architecture that protects it. Courts have consistently ruled that charging inmates for their own incarceration doesn't violate the Constitution. It's not a fine, legally speaking, because fines require a conviction. It's not punishment, because it's framed as reimbursement. It exists in a carefully constructed gap between debtor's prison, which is illegal, and user fees, which are not. The county becomes landlord and tenant becomes debtor. And the fact that the tenant was held against their will under the coercive power of the state somehow doesn't factor into the equation. And yet the fees keep expanding. Some counties have added administrative fees, processing fees, fees for medical care, fees for phone calls, fees for existing. The itemized bill looks like a hotel invoice, except hotels don't arrest you for leaving. By the time someone walks out of a county jail, they are not just marked by the experience, they are financially shackled to it. The cruelty wasn't just imprisonment, it was billing for it. And the worst part, the part that should make every taxpayer wince, is that it was all perfectly, legally, bureaucratically sanctioned. The county got its revenue, the collection agencies got their cut, and the person who spent months in a cell waiting for justice that never required incarceration in the first place got a bill with interest. But if charging rent for a cell sounds dystopian, wait until you hear what they charge for a 3-minute phone call home. 2. Prison phone call extortion, $15. That's what it costs to talk to your mother for 15 minutes when you're behind bars. Not because of technology limitations or operational costs, because a handful of private companies have monopoly contracts with prisons and have decided that desperation is a commodity worth mining. Outside these walls, a 15-minute phone call is functionally free. Inside, it's a luxury that drains bank accounts and severs family ties one expensive minute at a time. The numbers are staggering in their casual cruelty. In some state facilities, phone rates hover around $1 per minute. In county jails where contracts are less regulated and oversight is practically non-existent, rates can climb even higher. A mother in Arkansas trying to talk to her incarcerated son pays $16 for a 15-minute call. A wife in Texas pays nearly the same. The per-minute cost is 10, sometimes 20 times higher than any consumer rate on the outside. And there's no shopping around, no competitor offering a better deal. The prison signs an exclusive contract with one company, and that company owns every conversation that happens behind those walls. 2 corporations dominate this market with the efficiency of a cartel. Securus Technologies and Global Tel Link, known as GTL, control roughly 70% of prison and jail phone systems nationwide. They bid for contracts with correctional facilities, promising kickbacks disguised as commissions. The prison gets a percentage of every call, sometimes as much as 50% of the revenue. So when an inmate's family pays $1 a minute, 50 cents goes to the phone company, and 50 cents goes back to the facility. It's a partnership built on the financial desperation of people who have no other way to maintain contact with loved ones. For years, this arrangement was framed as a necessary evil. Prison phone systems are expensive to maintain, officials insisted. Security monitoring requires infrastructure. The contracts help offset operational costs. But the math never added up. The technology required to route and record a phone call is decades old and costs pennies to operate. The markup wasn't covering costs. It was generating profit, and the people paying for it weren't criminals with disposable income. They were grandmothers, wives, children, struggling to keep relationships alive across concrete and razor wire. The Federal Communications Commission noticed? In 2014, they attempted to cap prison phone rates, limiting interstate calls to around 25 cents per minute. The phone companies sued immediately, and they won repeatedly, finding sympathetic judges who ruled that the FCC didn't have authority to regulate intrastate calls, only those crossing state lines. The loophole was enormous. Most prison calls are local. Most never cross state boundaries. So the cap, when it finally survived litigation, applied to a tiny fraction of the market. The rest remained untouched, unregulated, exorbitantly priced. It turns out that expensive phone calls don't just hurt wallets. They sever connections that research has consistently shown reduce recidivism. Inmates who maintain regular contact with family are 40% less likely to reoffend after release. The data is clear, replicated across decades of studies. Family contact is one of the single most effective tools for successful reentry, and yet the system has monetized it, turned it into a revenue stream, made it so expensive that many families simply can't afford to maintain it. Mothers stop calling, children drift away, marriages collapse under the weight of $15 conversations, and yet the contracts keep renewing. Facilities continue signing with the same companies. The commissions keep flowing into prison budgets, funding everything from staff parties to equipment upgrades. The phone monopolies remain entrenched, protected by exclusive contracts that lock out competitors and lock in captive consumers who have no choice but to pay whatever rate appears on the screen. Video calls, marketed as a modern alternative, somehow cost even more. A 30-minute video session can run $20 or higher, with connection fees and surcharges piled on top. The call wasn't just expensive, it was a tax on love, and the companies profiting from it didn't just get away with it. They got contracts renewed, boards of directors paid, shareholders satisfied. The family trying to stay connected got a bill. The inmate trying to hear his daughter's voice got silence when the money ran out. And the cycle that might have been broken by a simple phone call kept spinning, funded by monopoly and measured in minutes that cost more than most people earn in an hour. Which brings us to another kind of isolation, one that doesn't just separate families, but bodies from basic dignity. 3. Menstrual product restrictions. In the hierarchy of basic human needs, menstruation doesn't even rank, not constitutionally, not in most prison budgets, and certainly not in the minds of the primarily male legislators who write incarceration policy, which is how you end up with women bleeding through uniforms, fashioning makeshift products from toilet paper, or rationing 3 pads across 5 days. The body has requirements. The state has decided those requirements are negotiable. Most facilities provide menstrual products. Technically, the word provide, however, does heavy lifting in that sentence. In many state prisons, women receive 10 to 12 pads per month. If you're doing the math, that's 2 to 3 pads per day, during a cycle that can last 5 to 7 days and require changing products every 4 to 6 hours depending on flow. The numbers don't work. They've never worked, but the policy remains unchanged, as if menstruation were a luxury that could be rationed into compliance. What happens when 12 pads aren't enough is grimly predictable. Women bleed through their clothes. They reuse pads beyond any reasonable hygiene standard. They stuff toilet paper into their underwear and hope it holds. Or they do what the system clearly intends them to do. They buy more from the commissary, where a box of tampons that costs $4 at any drugstore in America runs $8, sometimes $10 behind prison walls. Pads are similarly marked up. And if you're earning 25 cents an hour at your prison job, a box of tampons represents 32 hours of labor. more than a week's wages for a basic biological necessity. Some facilities add another layer of humiliation: written requests. To receive your state-issued allotment of menstrual products, you must fill out a form. Submit it to a guard, often male. Wait for approval. Wait for processing. Wait for someone to retrieve the products from storage and deliver them to your unit. The wait can take days, during which you're still menstruating, still bleeding, still expected to maintain the routine of prison life, as if your body weren't actively betraying you in a system designed to ignore it. Federal prisons only mandated free menstrual products in 2017. The First Step Act, a rare piece of bipartisan criminal justice reform, included a provision requiring federal facilities to provide them at no cost. It was considered progressive, groundbreaking even, that it took until 2017 for the federal government to acknowledge that women need menstrual products without being charged for them, says everything about how the system views incarcerated women. State facilities, meanwhile, remain a patchwork. Some have followed the federal lead. Most have not. The map of states providing free menstrual products looks disturbingly similar to other maps of states resistant to acknowledging women's health care as health care. The health consequences are exactly what you'd expect when you force women to choose between hygiene and other necessities. Infections, toxic shock syndrome, rare but documented, reproductive health issues that go untreated because asking for help requires admitting you couldn't afford the products the state should have provided in adequate supply. Medical copays, already a barrier, become another calculation. Do you pay $5 to see a nurse about an infection? Or do you buy the pads you needed 2 weeks ago? Advocates have been screaming about this for decades. Medical professionals have testified. The research is unambiguous. Adequate menstrual care is not optional. It's basic health and dignity. But dignity is expensive when you're running a prison on a budget that prioritizes security cameras over sanitary napkins. The policy persists because addressing it would require acknowledging that incarcerated women are still women, still human, still subject to biological processes that don't pause for punishment. The system didn't deny that menstruation existed. It just decided managing it wasn't the prison's problem. Biology, apparently, is something you're supposed to afford. And if you can't, well, there's always toilet paper and the vague hope that you won't develop an infection serious enough to require medical intervention that will cost you even more. But if the body is treated as inconvenience, labor is treated as something else entirely, something profitable. 4. Prison labor at slave wages. The 13th Amendment didn't abolish slavery. It relocated it. Right there in the text, clear as law can be. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. That except is a loophole you can drive an entire carceral economy through, and for over a century, that's exactly what's happened. Federal prisoners earn between 12 and 40 cents per hour. Some state prisoners earn nothing at all. 0. They work full shifts in prison industries, manufacturing furniture, processing food, answering customer service calls for private corporations, and receive no compensation beyond the privilege of avoiding disciplinary segregation. In states that do pay, the wages are a sick joke. Louisiana pays 4 cents an hour for some jobs. Texas and Georgia pay nothing for most. Alabama caps pay at 75 cents per day, not per hour, for a full day's labor. The work isn't optional. In most facilities, refusing a work assignment triggers punishment, loss of commissary privileges, loss of phone access, loss of good time credits that could reduce your sentence, placement in disciplinary housing. The refusal to work, even when the work pays pennies or nothing at all, is treated as insubordination, as a violation of prison rules that can extend your time behind bars. So you work. You manufacture license plates, You sew uniforms. You answer phones for companies that advertise customer service from within the United States, without mentioning that the United States includes inside a prison. The economic value generated by this labor runs into the billions. Estimates vary depending on methodology, but even conservative calculations put the annual value of prison labor between $2 and $11 billion. Inmates make everything from office furniture, sold to government agencies, to lingerie that ends up in department stores. They operate call centers, fight wildfires, clean highways, farm crops. The labor is real. The productivity is real. The compensation is a rounding error. California's prison firefighter program has become particularly notorious. Inmates risk their lives battling wildfires that rage across the state every summer, doing the same dangerous work as civilian firefighters. They earn between $2 and $5 per day, not per hour, per day. When they're actively fighting fires, they might earn an additional dollar per hour. So, a 12-hour shift battling flames that could kill them nets about $17. A civilian firefighter doing identical work earns exponentially more, receives benefits, and isn't doing it under threat of disciplinary action if they refuse. Private companies have discovered that prison labor offers something the free market can't. Workers who can't quit, can't unionize, can't negotiate for better wages, and can't refuse assignments. Corporations contract with prisons to use inmate labor for manufacturing, packaging, and data entry. The prison provides the workforce. The company pays the prison, not the workers. And the workers, earning cents per hour, have no recourse. No Department of Labor to file complaints with, no ability to take their skills elsewhere, no leverage whatsoever. The constitutional language is unambiguous. Slavery and involuntary servitude are legal when used as criminal punishment. Courts have upheld this interpretation repeatedly. Challenges claiming that forced labor for no or minimal pay violates human rights have failed. The 13th Amendment says what it says. The exception exists in plain text. And prison systems, state and federal, have built entire operational budgets around exploiting it. Inmates in several states have organized strikes, refusing work to demand better wages and conditions. In 2016, inmates across multiple facilities coordinated work stoppages. Some lasted days, some lasted weeks. The demands were modest: meaningful wages, safe working conditions, restoration of parole in states that had abolished it. The response was predictable. Ringleaders were placed in solitary confinement. Participants lost privileges. The strikes eventually collapsed under the weight of institutional retaliation. The wages didn't change. And yet, the labor continues. Every day in facilities across the country, inmates wake up and go to jobs that pay them less per hour than a cup of coffee costs. They manufacture goods that generate profit for someone else. They provide services that someone else bills for. And at the end of the day, their commissary account shows a deposit so small it barely covers a phone call home. The system calls this rehabilitation. It calls it job training. It calls it teaching, work ethic, and responsibility. It wasn't slavery, legally speaking. It was punishment. The difference, according to the Constitution, was one word. The result was exactly the same. And if their labor is worth pennies, their health is worth even less, at least according to the copay. 5. Medical copays in prison. Imagine you're having chest pains. Sharp, radiating, the kind that makes you think this might be it. Now imagine that seeing a doctor will cost you 3 days' wages, and you can't leave, and you can't call 911. And the facility isn't particularly concerned whether you're having a heart attack or indigestion. Welcome to prison healthcare economics, where seeking medical attention requires both suffering and math. 49 states charge medical copays to inmates. The amounts vary, but they range from $2 on the low end to $15 for a single sick call visit. $2 might sound negligible until you remember that prison wages hover around 25 cents per hour. A $2 copay represents 8 hours of work. A $5 copay, common in many states, represents a full week. $15, charged by some county jails, represents 2 months of wages for an inmate earning federal minimum prison pay. The copays apply to everything: sick calls for acute illness, chronic disease management, mental health appointments, medication refills. Emergency visits, theoretically, are supposed to be exempt, but the definition of emergency is flexible, applied inconsistently, and often determined after the fact. An inmate experiencing what feels like a cardiac event might wait hours to be seen, only to be told it was anxiety, and here's your $5 bill for wasting medical staff's time. The stated purpose of these copays is to reduce frivolous medical requests. Inmates, the logic goes, will flood the medical unit with minor complaints if there's no cost attached. They'll seek attention for every headache, every minor ache, every emotional crisis. The copay acts as a deterrent, ensuring that only legitimate medical needs get addressed. It's a theory that sounds plausible in budget meetings and collapses immediately upon contact with human behavior and basic medical ethics. Studies have consistently shown that copays don't reduce frivolous visits. They reduce all visits. People in genuine medical need delay seeking care because they can't afford the copay. They wait to see if the chest pain goes away. They hope the infected wound will heal on its own. They ration insulin, skip doses of blood pressure medication, avoid mental health appointments that might keep them stable. The copay doesn't filter out the hypochondriacs. It filters out the poor, which in prison is everyone. The consequences are entirely predictable and entirely ignored. Treatable conditions become critical. Infections spread. Chronic illnesses spiral out of control. Diabetics end up in crisis. Cardiac patients wait until they're in acute distress. And occasionally, people die. Their final calculations weighing the cost of medical care against the hope that they were wrong about how serious the symptoms were. Deductions come directly from commissary accounts. If you don't have money in your account, the copay gets logged as debt. The debt accumulates. And in some facilities, that debt prevents you from accessing commissary, from making phone calls, from purchasing the supplemental food and hygiene items that prison itself doesn't adequately provide. So you avoid medical care to preserve access to other necessities. The system has created a hierarchy of needs where all of them cost money, and none of them are actually met. The fee wasn't designed to fund health care. It was designed to make you think twice before asking for it. And in a system where hesitation can be fatal, that wasn't a bug. It was policy working exactly as intended, keeping costs down by making sure the cost fell on the people least able to afford it and most likely to suffer in silence. But physical health is only one front of institutional neglect. Mental health, particularly in isolation, is where policy becomes torture. 6. Solitary confinement without limits. 23 hours a day in a cell the size of a parking space. No human contact, no natural light, no meaningful stimulation. For a day, maybe you could manage. A week, you'd struggle. A year, you'd break. Now multiply that by 10, 20, sometimes 30 years. It's not hypothetical. It's legal. And it's happening in facilities across the country right now. The United States has no federal limit on how long a person can be held in solitary confinement. Individual states set their own policies, and most have decided that unlimited duration is acceptable. People have been held in isolation for decades. Albert Woodfox spent 43 years in solitary confinement in Louisiana, longer than most people spend in careers, longer than some people live. Tommy Silverstein died in solitary after spending 36 years there. These aren't statistical outliers. They're the extreme end of a practice that affects tens of thousands of inmates at any given time. Solitary confinement goes by many names: administrative segregation, restrictive housing, special management units. The terminology varies to obscure what's actually happening, which is this: a human being is locked in a small cell, alone, for at least 23 hours per day, sometimes 24, with minimal human interaction and almost no mental stimulation. They eat in their cell. They sleep in their cell. They defecate in their cell. They lose their minds in their cell. The reasons for placement are equally varied and often arbitrary. Disciplinary infractions, certainly. Fighting, drug possession, disobeying orders, but also gang affiliation, real or suspected. Protective custody for inmates at risk of violence. Administrative convenience when facilities are overcrowded. Mental illness, which often manifests as behavior that staff find disruptive. The mentally ill get placed in solitary, where isolation exacerbates their conditions, which leads to more disruptive behavior, which justifies continued isolation. It's a feedback loop designed to break people who were already broken. The United Nations has been unambiguous about this. In 2015, they revised the Mandela Rules, the international standards for the treatment of prisoners, to define solitary confinement beyond 15 consecutive days as torture. Torture. Not harsh, not unpleasant. Torture. The psychological research backing this classification is extensive and uncontested. Extended isolation causes hallucinations, paranoia, severe anxiety, uncontrollable rage, cognitive deterioration, and a breakdown of identity itself. People forget how to interact with others. They lose the ability to modulate their emotions. They develop symptoms indistinguishable from serious mental illness, even if they entered isolation mentally healthy. The United States looked at this research, at the UN designation, at the testimony of psychiatrists and neurologists and former inmates, and shrugged. Courts have consistently ruled that solitary confinement, even for extended periods, doesn't violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The reasoning is circular and infuriating. It's not unusual because we do it all the time. It's not cruel because we've defined cruelty narrowly enough to exclude it. Racial disparities in solitary placement mirror every other racial disparity in the criminal justice system, only more extreme. Black inmates are placed in solitary at disproportionately high rates. They stay longer. They're more likely to be there for administrative reasons rather than specific infractions. The same patterns repeat in facility after facility, state after state, suggesting not individual bias, but systemic design. Some facilities have begun reforms, limiting solitary to 90 days, restricting its use for mentally ill inmates, providing more out-of-cell time, more programming, more human contact. These reforms are celebrated as progressive when they occur, which tells you everything about how low the baseline has fallen. 90 days in isolation is still torture. It's just shorter torture. Torture with better PR. The men and women who emerge from extended solitary confinement often don't emerge intact. They're released into general population or directly into society, depending on their sentences, carrying trauma that manifests as paranoia, difficulty communicating, explosive anger, or catatonic withdrawal. Reentry programs, already inadequate, aren't designed to address the specific psychological damage of years spent in a concrete box. So people fail. They violate parole. They can't hold jobs. They self-medicate. And they often end up back inside, sometimes back in solitary, the cycle completing itself. It wasn't officially torture. The courts had been very careful about that distinction. But the men who emerged from those cells, shattered and disoriented, didn't particularly care about semantics. Their minds bore the marks of years in silence, and no amount of legal reasoning could rebuild what isolation had systematically destroyed. While some prisoners are isolated from human contact, others are isolated from the outside world in a different way, through paywalls. 7. Charging for prison email. Email is free. It's been free for decades. Unless you're in prison, in which case, a simple thinking of you message to your daughter can cost $1 per message, with character limits and restrictions on attachments. And monitoring that makes every word feel like evidence. The same companies that dominate prison phone systems have expanded into electronic messaging with the same business model: captive audience, monopoly contract, maximum extraction. JPay, now owned by Securus, controls email in most state prison systems. CoreLinks handles federal facilities. GTL operates its own messaging platform. Between them, they've turned what should be the cheapest form of communication into another profit center, charging for technology that costs them virtually nothing to operate. The pricing structures vary by facility, but they're uniformly predatory. Some systems charge per message, anywhere from 25 cents to $1 for each email sent or received. Others charge by time, billing per minute while you're typing, like parking meters for correspondence. Character limits are common, capping messages at a length that might fit on a postcard, forcing longer conversations into multiple billable messages. And if you want to include a photo, if you want your daughter to see your face, or your mother to receive a picture you drew, that's an additional fee. Sometimes several dollars for a single image. Physical mail, for all its inefficiency, costs 55 cents for a stamp. An inmate can write pages, seal an envelope, and send it for less than $1. Email, which requires no physical materials, no transportation, no postal workers, costs more. The markup isn't justified by operational expenses. It's justified by the same logic that allows dollar per minute phone calls. Because we can, because they can't go anywhere else, because desperation doesn't comparison shop. The systems are marketed as modernization. Families are told that electronic messaging is more convenient, faster, more reliable than physical mail. And it is, if you can afford it. But many can't command. Families already paying for phone calls, already sending money for commissary, already stretched thin by the financial burden of supporting someone inside, can't also budget for email messages that cost more than stamps. So communication dwindles. Birthdays pass without messages. Job offers expire before inmates can respond. Children grow up with less contact than technology should enable. Meanwhile, physical mail becomes more restricted. Some facilities have moved to digitize all incoming mail, photographing it, and delivering digital scans to inmates through the same paid email systems. It's framed as security, preventing contraband in envelopes. The effect is another revenue stream. Your grandmother writes you a letter. The prison scans it. You pay to read the scan. Modernization as profit strategy. The technology was 20 years old. The fees were completely modern, and the profit motive was as old as prisons themselves, dressed up in user interfaces and branded as innovation when it was just another way to charge people for maintaining relationships that everyone agrees reduce recidivism and improve outcomes. And speaking of technology replacing humanity, some facilities have decided that video screens are an adequate substitute for visiting rooms. 8. Video-only visitation. Your son is in a facility 20 minutes from your house. You haven't touched him in 18 months. Not a hug, not a handshake, not a pat on the shoulder. Not because he's in maximum security or because he's violated visitation rules, because the county decided that video conferencing was more efficient. And efficient in this context means profitable. Over 500 jails across the United States have eliminated in-person visits entirely, replacing them with video visitation systems that require families to pay per session. The facilities are often local. County jails holding people awaiting trial, people who haven't been convicted of anything, people who might be released in days or weeks once their cases resolve. Their families live nearby, sometimes in the same town, sometimes blocks away. And they're told that if they want to see their loved one, they'll need to do it through a screen. From home. For a fee. The systems work like this. A family member logs into a platform, often the same companies running phone and email services, and books a video session. 20 minutes costs anywhere from $5 to $15, depending on the facility and the contract. The quality is reliably poor. Connections freeze. Audio cuts out. Screens pixelate into abstract blurs. Technical difficulties eat into paid time, and there are no refunds for sessions that don't work. You pay for the attempt, not the result. Facilities justify this shift with a variety of explanations. Security primarily. Video visits reduce the risk of contraband being passed during in-person contact. They reduce staffing needs since guards don't have to supervise visiting rooms. They're more convenient for families, administrators claim, because you can visit from home without driving to the facility. The convenience argument collapses under minimal scrutiny. Most families would prefer the free option of driving 20 minutes over the paid option of a glitchy video call. But the free option no longer exists. The real reason, barely disguised, is revenue. Video visitation contracts generate income for facilities through the same commission structure that governs phone calls. The companies pay the jail a percentage of every session booked, so eliminating in-person visits doesn't just reduce costs. It creates a new profit stream from families who have no alternative if they want to see their incarcerated relative. Research on the importance of in-person contact is unambiguous. Physical presence matters. Touch matters. Face-to-face interaction without technological mediation strengthens family bonds, reduces institutional stress, and improves outcomes. Video calls are better than nothing, but they're not equivalent. They flatten human connection into pixels and compress it into 20-minute increments that cost more than most people earn in an hour. Children visiting incarcerated parents are particularly affected. A 5-year-old doesn't understand why they can't hug their father. They don't understand why the person on the screen keeps freezing, or why their time is up after 20 minutes when they've barely started talking. The sessions often end in tears, confusion, and a sense that the parent isn't really there. Because in a meaningful sense, they're not. Some jurisdictions have pushed back. Community advocates have fought to restore in-person visits. A few facilities have reversed course after public pressure. But most continue with video-only policies, insulated by the same legal deference that allows prisons and jails to make operational decisions without meaningful oversight. Courts have generally ruled that inmates have no constitutional right to in-person visits, which means eliminating them doesn't violate any protected interest. The screen between them wasn't there for security. It was there for revenue. And the hug they couldn't share wasn't a safety risk. It was a lost profit center, eliminated in favor of a system that charged for the pale simulation of presence. But at least those families could afford the video calls. Not everyone can. Which brings us to the equally legal practice of charging inmates to read. 9. Charging for books and educational materials. In most of the developed world, access to books is considered fundamental to rehabilitation. In American prisons, it's considered a privilege, one you have to purchase from approved vendors at markups that would make airport bookstores blush. And if someone tries to mail you a book, maybe a textbook for the GED you're trying to earn, rejected. Policy violation. Prison libraries exist technically. They're required in most jurisdictions. What's not required is adequate funding, sufficient selections, or materials beyond decades-old donated paperbacks with missing pages and broken spines. The typical prison library operates on a budget that wouldn't sustain a small-town branch for a month. Books are limited. Wait lists are long. And the selection rarely extends beyond worn-out fiction and outdated reference materials that predate the internet. So inmates who want to read, who want to study, who want to prepare for life after release by educating themselves, turn to outside sources. Family members who want to send books, organizations that donate educational materials, friends who think a particular title might help, and they run directly into policies designed to make this as difficult and expensive as possible. Many facilities have banned book donations entirely. No packages from Amazon, no shipments from family, no used books from charitable organizations. The justification is always security. Books could contain contraband, officials claim, drugs soaked into pages, weapons hidden in spines, SIM cards tucked between chapters. The theoretical risk is used to justify blanket prohibitions that eliminate the most accessible source of reading material for people who have no income to purchase alternatives. Instead, facilities contract with approved vendors, usually one or two companies that have exclusive rights to sell books to inmates in that prison system. The vendors mark up prices because why wouldn't they? A paperback that costs $10 on the outside runs $15 in the prison catalog. Textbooks cost even more. And inmates, earning pennies per hour if they're working at all, have to save for weeks or months to afford a single book, while the library waitlist for that same title stretches into years. The absurdity reaches peak satire when religious texts are exempted from restrictions while secular books face scrutiny. A Bible can be mailed directly from any source. A dictionary requires vendor approval and sometimes gets rejected for security reasons that are never quite explained. The message is clear. Prayer is encouraged. Education is suspect. Educational materials face even stricter barriers. GED prep books, college textbooks, vocational training manuals, all the resources that might actually prepare someone for employment after release are either unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Some facilities offer educational programs, but slots are limited and materials are often outdated. The inmate who wants to study independently, who wants to learn a trade or complete a degree, faces a maze of restrictions that make the effort nearly impossible. Studies have shown this repeatedly. Education is the single most effective intervention for reducing recidivism. Inmates who participate in educational programs are 43% less likely to return to prison. The data is clear, replicated across decades of research, and completely ignored by policies that treat books as security threats and learning as a luxury reserved for those who can afford vendor markups. The irony is sharp enough to draw blood. Prisons are supposed to rehabilitate. Education rehabilitates better than anything else the system has attempted. And yet access to education is systematically restricted, monetized, and treated as a privilege to be earned rather than a resource to be provided. The book wasn't dangerous. The knowledge inside it wasn't contraband. But free access to either threatened something the system valued more than rehabilitation: control, revenue, and the carefully maintained ignorance that keeps people cycling through the same facilities year after year. And if you think restricting reading is medieval, wait until you see what passes for food. If the math is already making you nauseous, you're paying attention. There's more, and it gets worse. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, because this system doesn't reform itself just because we look away. Drop a comment. What shocked you most so far? Or share this with someone who thinks the system is working exactly as it should. Sometimes the best education is discomfort. 10. Nutritionally inadequate food. There's hungry, and then there's prison hungry. The kind that comes from eating 1,800 calories a day when you're working labor details. The kind that comes from meals designed by the lowest bidder, assembled by inmates earning pennies, and served by a system that views food as a necessary expense to be minimized rather than a basic human need to be met. The United States has no federal nutritional standards for prison meals. None. The Department of Agriculture sets standards for school lunches, for meals served to children who spend 6 hours in a building. But adults confined to prisons 24 hours a day, doing physical labor, dealing with the stress and violence of incarceration? No standards. Each state, each facility, each county jail sets its own policies, and those policies are inevitably shaped by whoever can deliver the most food for the least money. The math reveals itself in the trays. Portions that wouldn't satisfy a middle schooler. Protein sources of mysterious origin and dubious quality. Vegetables that might have been vegetables once, boiled into submission and served in quantities measured by accountants rather than nutritionists. Bread, lots of bread, because carbohydrates are cheap and filling. The meals meet a technical definition of food. They rarely meet any reasonable definition of adequate nutrition. Caloric content hovers around 1,800 to 2,000 calories per day in most facilities. For context, the recommended daily intake for an adult male doing moderate activity is around 2,500 calories. For someone doing heavy physical labor, it's 3,000 or more. Prison meals systematically underfeed the population they're supposed to sustain. Inmates lose weight, not the healthy kind. The kind that comes from the body consuming itself because intake doesn't match output. Quality is where the real horror lives. Meat arrives in blocks, unidentifiable in origin, processed beyond recognition. Milk is powdered when it appears at all. Fruit is a luxury reserved for holidays or contractual obligations. What gets served is whatever the food service contract specifies at the lowest possible cost per meal. Some facilities spend less than $3 per inmate per day on food. $3 for 3 meals. The gas station lunch has better nutritional value. Then there's Nutriloaf, the punishment within the punishment. A dense brick of blended food, all the meal components mixed together, baked into a loaf that meets technical nutritional requirements while being deliberately unpleasant to eat. It's used as discipline. Act out and you get Nutriloaf for days or weeks. Prisons defend it as ensuring adequate nutrition during disciplinary segregation. Everyone else recognizes it as weaponized food, punishment through palatability. In some states, sheriffs are allowed to pocket leftover food budget money. It's a 19th century policy that survives into the present because nobody's bothered to eliminate it. Sheriffs have a fixed per diem for feeding inmates. Whatever they don't spend, they keep. The incentive structure is obscene. Feed inmates less, pocket the difference. Some sheriffs have made hundreds of thousands of dollars this way, buying beach houses with money saved by serving smaller portions and cheaper ingredients. Commissary becomes not supplemental, but necessary. The food provided by the facility doesn't sustain basic health, so inmates who can afford it buy ramen, chips, canned goods, anything with calories and flavor. Commissary sales generate profit for facilities. The inadequate meals aren't a failure of the system. They're a feature driving inmates and their families to spend money on food that should have been provided in the first place. Health consequences follow predictably. Malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, weight loss that weakens immune systems, chronic conditions that worsen without proper nutrition. Diabetics struggling to manage blood sugar on meals heavy in refined carbohydrates. The medical costs eventually exceed whatever was saved on food budgets, but those costs hit different line items and different fiscal years, so nobody connects them. The meals weren't technically starvation, they just resembled it closely enough that the difference didn't matter to the body breaking down in cell block C, wondering if the commissary would restock before the hunger became something more serious than discomfort. But malnutrition is a slow cruelty. Some policies are far more immediate, like shackling women in labor. 11. Shackling pregnant women during labor. Imagine giving birth while handcuffed to a hospital bed, or shackled at the ankles while trying to push, or restrained so tightly during contractions that you can't shift position to manage the pain. It's not a medieval torture scenario. It's standard operating procedure in prisons across multiple states, because flight risk, apparently, is a concern when a woman is mid-contraction and screaming into a hospital gown. 22 states have no laws prohibiting the shackling of pregnant women during labor and delivery. In those states, correctional officers have discretion to restrain incarcerated women throughout the entire birth process. Handcuffs during labor. leg irons during delivery. Waist chains during postpartum recovery. Some women have reported being shackled to the bed frame while pushing, unable to move their legs into positions that might ease the pain or facilitate delivery. Others have described being restrained immediately after birth, denied the ability to hold their newborn because their wrists were cuffed to a gurney. The medical community has been unambiguous in its condemnation. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists opposes the practice. The American Medical Association opposes it. The American Public Health Association opposes it. Every major medical organization with any stake in maternal health has stated clearly that shackling during labor poses serious risks to both mother and child. Restraints restrict movement that can be medically necessary during labor. They delay emergency interventions if complications arise. They cause psychological trauma that can interfere with the birth process itself. The health risks are specific and documented. Women in labor need to be able to change positions. Shifting helps manage pain, can speed delivery, and reduces the risk of complications. Shackling eliminates that mobility. If an emergency cesarean section is needed, seconds matter. Removing restraints takes time that a hemorrhaging mother doesn't have. If a woman needs to be moved quickly for fetal distress, shackles slow everything down. The restraints don't just add discomfort. They add measurable risk to an already vulnerable medical situation. And yet the practice continues, justified by the same security rationale that has justified every other dehumanizing prison policy. Pregnant women are still inmates, officials argue. Still a flight risk. Still subject to the same custody protocols as everyone else. The argument collapses under the weight of its own absurdity. There are no documented cases of women escaping from hospitals during active labor. None. The scenario that justifies the policy has never happened, but the policy remains, defended with hypotheticals that ignore both medical reality and basic human decency. Many of the states that have passed anti-shackling laws did so only recently, in the last 10 to 15 years. The reforms came slowly, state by state, often after lawsuits or advocacy campaigns that forced legislators to confront what was happening in delivery rooms under their jurisdiction. The laws vary in strength. Some ban all restraints during labor and delivery. Others allow restraints if deemed necessary by security staff, which is functionally no ban at all, since security staff can deem anything necessary. The psychological impact extends beyond the physical risks. Giving birth is traumatic under the best circumstances. Doing it while restrained, while being treated as a security threat during one of the most vulnerable moments in human experience, creates trauma that research suggests can interfere with bonding, increase postpartum depression, and compound the already difficult challenge of maintaining parental relationships from inside prison. Women who give birth in shackles carry that experience with them. The restraints come off. The memory doesn't. International human rights organizations have classified the practice as a form of torture. The United Nations has specifically called on the United States to eliminate it. Other countries look at this policy and see brutality masquerading as procedure. American corrections officials look at it and see protocol, security, necessary precautions against a threat that exists only in imagination. The shackles weren't there to prevent escape. They were there because removing them would require acknowledging that pregnant women are human first, inmates second. And the system wasn't ready for that math. Still isn't in 22 states where the policy continues, where women continue giving birth in restraints, where the pain of labor is amplified by chains that serve no purpose except to remind everyone involved that punishment doesn't even for something as fundamental as bringing life into the world. While pregnant women are restrained, other inmates find themselves restrained by a different kind of chain, debt, the kind that starts before conviction and never stops growing. 12. Public defender fees. The Sixth Amendment guarantees you an attorney if you can't afford one. What it doesn't mention is the bill you'll receive afterward. Because in over 40 states, the free public defender isn't free at all. It's a loan, one you can't refuse, didn't negotiate, and will be paying off long after your sentence ends. 43 states allow charging defendants for public defense services. The fees range from $50 on the low end to several hundred per case, depending on jurisdiction and the complexity of the charges. Some charge a flat application fee. Others bill by the hour, tracking every minute your court-appointed attorney spends on your case and sending you an itemized invoice when it's over. The charges apply regardless of outcome. Found guilty? You owe. Charges dropped? You still owe. Acquitted after trial? Congratulations on your freedom, and here's your bill for defending it. The logic, when officials bother to explain it, goes something like this. Public defense is expensive. Taxpayers shouldn't bear the entire burden, and defendants should contribute to the cost of services they receive. It sounds almost reasonable until you remember that these are people who, by definition, couldn't afford a private attorney. The court has already determined they're too poor to hire counsel, and now that same court is billing them for the counsel it was constitutionally required to provide. The fees get added to an already crushing pile of legal financial obligations. Court costs, fines, restitution, supervision fees, all stacking on top of each other until the total debt reaches amounts that would take years to pay off even with stable employment, which most defendants don't have. Because the criminal justice system is remarkably effective at destabilizing employment, housing, and family connections that might provide financial support. Collection methods vary but share a common thread of aggressive pursuit. Wage garnishment when defendants manage to find work, interception of tax refunds, suspension of driver's licenses, which makes getting to work impossible, which makes paying the debt impossible, which justifies further penalties. In some jurisdictions, unpaid public defender fees can trigger contempt charges or additional court appearances, generating more fees in a spiral that never resolves. The constitutional right begins to look less like a guarantee and more like a transaction you were forced into and are now being held responsible for financing. Poor defendants face an impossible choice. Represent yourself and almost certainly lose, or accept representation and certainly go into debt. Most choose debt. The alternative is usually prison. Legal challenges to public defender fees have largely failed. Courts have upheld the practice, ruling that charging for appointed counsel doesn't violate the Sixth Amendment as long as defendants receive adequate representation. The fact that they're billing people who can't afford lawyers for lawyers they couldn't afford apparently doesn't register as contradiction. It registers as cost recovery. The system has managed to turn a constitutional right into a revenue stream. The same document that guarantees counsel to those who can't afford it has been interpreted to allow billing them anyway, extracting payment from people who were already determined to be indigent. The paperwork calls it reimbursement. The people receiving bills call it something else entirely. The right to an attorney was guaranteed. The right to afford that attorney was apparently optional. And the irony of charging the poor for poverty defense was lost on exactly no one except the people writing the checks to collection agencies while trying to figure out how to pay rent. But public defender debt is just the entry fee. Once you're in the system, the bills multiply. Sometimes for things that sound like parody. 13. Commissary price gouging. A pack of ramen noodles costs about 25 cents at a gas station. In prison commissary, it's $1. Toothpaste that costs $2 at Walmart runs $5 behind bars. Soap, deodorant, stamps, everything marked up like the prison is a remote island and these are imported luxuries. The difference, of course, is that you can leave an island. Commissary items carry markups of 100 to 400%, depending on the facility and the vendor contract. A jar of peanut butter that sells for $4 outside costs $9 in commissary. Instant coffee runs triple the retail price. Basic hygiene products, the things that should be provided adequately by the facility, but aren't, become luxury purchases that require saving wages from weeks of prison labor. The market dynamics are textbook monopoly. One vendor, exclusive contract, captive consumers with zero alternatives. Inmates can't shop around. They can't refuse to buy. They can't order from Amazon or walk to a corner store. The commissary is the only source for supplemental food, for hygiene products beyond the bare minimum the facility provides, for stamps and envelopes, and anything that might maintain connection to the outside world. And the commissary knows it. Keefe Group, Trinity Services, a handful of companies dominate the prison commissary market. They bid for contracts with correctional facilities, often sweetening the deal with commission payments. The prison gets a percentage of commissary sales, sometimes as much as 30 or 40%. So the facility has a financial incentive to keep prices high and ensure inmates need to buy from commissary by providing inadequate supplies through regular channels. Families bear much of this burden. Inmates earning pennies per hour can't afford commissary prices on their own wages. So family members deposit money into commissary accounts, sometimes hundreds of dollars per month, to ensure their incarcerated loved one has toothpaste and deodorant and enough food to supplement inadequate prison meals. The families are already stretched thin by phone bills and video visit costs, and gas money for in-person visits when those still exist. Commissary becomes another tax on maintaining relationships across prison walls. The items aren't luxury goods, they're necessities: soap, shampoo, feminine hygiene products that the facility doesn't provide in adequate quantity. Food to fill the gap between what's served and what constitutes adequate nutrition. Writing supplies for people trying to maintain correspondence with children or lawyers, or anyone who might help them rebuild after release. The markup isn't on premium chocolates and imported cheeses. It's on the basic components of human dignity. Officials justify the prices as covering operational costs, inventory management, staffing, security screening of commissary items. But the profit margins reveal a different story. These aren't cost recovery prices. They're profit maximization prices, set as high as the market will bear when the market has no choice but to bear them. The prices weren't set by supply and demand. They were set by monopoly and desperation. And the invisible hand of the market had become an iron fist, extracting maximum revenue from people who couldn't walk away, couldn't negotiate, couldn't do anything except pay whatever was charged or go without. While commissary empties wallets, another policy empties something more fundamental: the right to vote. 14. Felony disenfranchisement. In most democracies, serving your time means your debt to society is paid. In the United States, it means you've lost access to one of the most fundamental rights of citizenship, possibly forever. In 11 states, a felony conviction can strip you of the right to vote for life. Not while you're incarcerated, not while you're on parole. For life. After you've done your time, paid your fines, and returned to being a tax-paying citizen who follows every condition of release, you still can't vote. Only 2 states, Maine and Vermont, allow people to vote while incarcerated. 2. Out of 50. The rest impose some form of voting restriction on people with felony convictions. 48 states strip voting rights from people currently serving time. 35 states extend the ban to people on parole. 30 states include probationers. And those 11 states, the harshest tier, permanently disenfranchise some or all people with felony records even after they've completed every aspect of their sentence. The numbers are staggering. More than 5.2 million Americans are currently disenfranchised due to felony convictions. That's roughly 1 in 44 adults. In states with the most restrictive laws, the percentages climb higher. In Florida, before recent reforms, 1 in 10 adults couldn't vote due to a past conviction. The impact falls disproportionately on Black Americans. 1 in 13 black adults is disenfranchised nationally. In some states, that number rises to 1 in 5. This isn't accidental. The history of felony disenfranchisement laws traces directly back to the post-Reconstruction era, when Southern states sought new methods to suppress black political power after the 15th Amendment made race-based voting restrictions unconstitutional. The strategy was elegant in its cruelty. Criminalize behaviors more likely to be prosecuted in black communities. Attach voting bans to those crimes. The laws didn't mention race. They didn't have to. The results spoke clearly enough. For over a century, this was accepted as standard practice, barely questioned, rarely challenged. The assumption held that people who broke the law had forfeited their right to participate in making it. But that assumption collapses when you look at how laws get made, who they target, and what happens after sentences are served. Restoration processes exist in some states, theoretically, but they're often Byzantine, requiring paperwork that goes unfilled, hearings that never get scheduled, and fees that can't be paid. In Florida, voters passed a constitutional amendment in 2018, restoring voting rights to people with felony convictions who had completed their sentences. The legislature responded by defining completed sentences to include all fines, fees, and restitution, amounts that often run into thousands of dollars and were never tracked systematically. The restoration became contingent on paying debts that many people didn't know they owed and couldn't afford if they did. Most other democracies allow prisoners to vote: Canada, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, South Africa, Israel. Even while incarcerated, citizens retain their right to participate in elections. The reasoning is straightforward. Democratic legitimacy requires that all people subject to laws have some say in making them. Punishment can include loss of freedom. It shouldn't include permanent loss of political voice. The sentence ended. The punishment continued, and the right to participate in the democracy that created these laws remained frustratingly, permanently out of reach for millions of people who pay taxes, follow rules, and live as citizens in every way, except the one that might allow them to change the system that continues excluding them. While some lose the right to vote, others lose something more concrete before they're even convicted: their property. 15. Civil asset forfeiture. You don't have to be convicted of a crime to lose your car, your house, or your life savings. You don't even have to be charged. All it takes is suspicion. A police officer's belief that your property was somehow involved in criminal activity. That's it. And then it's not your property anymore. It's the state's. And you, the person who hasn't been convicted of anything, have to prove why you deserve it back. Civil asset forfeiture operates on a legal fiction so absurd it sounds like satire. The property itself is charged with a crime, not you. Your car, your cash, your home. The legal paperwork reads like comedy. State of Oklahoma versus $1,500 in United States currency. Texas versus one blue 2004 Ford F-150. The property stands accused. The property must defend itself. And since property can't hire lawyers or make arguments, it tends to lose. The standard of proof is suspicion, not beyond a reasonable doubt, not even preponderance of evidence, just probable cause, the same standard that allows police to conduct a search. If an officer believes your property was connected to drug activity, was purchased with drug money, or might be used for future crimes, they can seize it. Right there, on the side of the road, during a traffic stop, at your home during a search. The property is gone before you're arrested, often before you're even aware you're under investigation. Challenging a seizure requires filing a claim, hiring an attorney, and navigating a civil court process entirely separate from any criminal case. The costs often exceed the value of the property. Lose $5,000 in cash during a traffic stop? Hiring a lawyer to fight for its return will cost more than $5,000. Most people do the math and walk away. The property stays seized. The state keeps it. the lack of a challenge becomes evidence that the property was rightfully taken. The burden of proof reverses. You must prove your innocence, or, more precisely, your property's innocence. You must demonstrate that the cash in your glove box came from legitimate sources, that you can document every deposit, every withdrawal, every transaction, that your car wasn't used by someone else to transport drugs, that your house where police found your roommate with marijuana shouldn't be forfeit despite your complete ignorance of what was happening in the other bedroom. Law enforcement agencies keep the proceeds. That's the mechanism that transforms a dubious practice into a systemic problem. The money and property seized through forfeiture go directly into the budgets of the agencies that seized them. Police departments buy new equipment. Sheriff's offices fund training programs. District attorneys upgrade their technology. The revenue doesn't go to general state funds or social programs. It goes right back to the agencies that have an incentive to seize more next year. The incentive structure is perverse and predictable. Departments target assets, not crimes. Traffic stops on highways known for cash transportation increase dramatically. Small-town police forces seize cars and cash from out-of-state travelers who are unlikely to return for court proceedings. In some jurisdictions, seizures make up significant portions of law enforcement budgets, creating dependence on continued forfeiture to maintain operations. Billions get seized annually. The Institute for Justice tracks these numbers. In recent years, the total has approached $5 billion per year in asset forfeitures at federal and state levels combined. A fraction of that comes from people actually convicted of crimes. Most comes from people never charged, or charged and acquitted, or who simply couldn't afford the legal battle to get their property back. Racial disparities mirror every other aspect of policing. Black and Hispanic drivers are disproportionately subjected to searches and seizures. The property taken is often small amounts, a few $1,000s in cash. A used car, amounts that devastate working families, but barely register in departmental budgets, beyond being another line item in the forfeiture column. Recent reforms have nibbled at the edges. Some states have raised the standard of proof required for forfeiture. Others have redirected forfeiture proceeds to general funds rather than directly to law enforcement. But most jurisdictions continue operating under the same system: legal plunder dressed in procedure and justified by the war on drugs that has long since become a war on the poor. It wasn't theft, legally speaking. It was forfeiture. The difference mattered to courts and dictionaries, to the single mother whose car was seized during a traffic stop, to the small business owner whose cash deposit was taken at the airport. The distinction was academic. The property was gone. The burden was theirs, and the system that took it faced no burden at all. While civil forfeiture takes property without trial, another policy takes freedom without proportionality. 3 strikes, and you're gone. Forever. 16. 3 strikes laws. Baseball is a game of second chances. 3 strikes in prison policy is a life sentence, and the 3rd strike doesn't have to be murder or assault. In some states, it can be shoplifting. It can be drug possession. It can be writing a bad check. The punishment is the same: mandatory life in prison, no possibility of parole, no judicial discretion, no consideration of circumstances. 28 states have 3 strikes laws on their books. The specifics vary, but the core mechanism remains consistent. 3 felony convictions, or in some versions, 3 serious felonies, trigger automatic life sentences. California's version, passed in 1994 during the peak of tough on crime politics, is among the harshest. The 3rd strike can be any felony, not just violent crimes. Which is how Jerry Dwayne Williams ended up serving 25 years to life for stealing a slice of pizza. Williams was homeless. He grabbed a slice of pizza from a group of children on the pier in Redondo Beach. It was petty theft, a misdemeanor under normal circumstances. But because the pizza was taken from someone's hand, it qualified as robbery. And because Williams had 2 prior convictions, both nonviolent, That slice of pizza became his third strike. The judge had no discretion. The sentence was mandatory. Life in prison for pizza. The cases pile up like absurdist theater. Leandro Andrade received 2 consecutive 25 to life sentences for shoplifting 9 videotapes worth $150 from Kmart. Gary Ewing got 25 to life for stealing 3 golf clubs. The pattern repeats across California's and other 3-strike states. People whose third offense wouldn't normally draw more than a few months in county jail instead receive sentences that ensure they'll die in prison. The laws eliminate judicial discretion entirely, which is the point. 3 strikes were designed to remove the human element from sentencing, to make punishment automatic and severe. Judges can't consider rehabilitation. They can't weigh whether someone who stole golf clubs poses a threat to public safety. They can't look at the 30 years that passed since the previous conviction and conclude that maybe this person isn't the same as they were decades ago. The math is simple. 3 felonies equals life. Everything else is irrelevant. Racial disparities are pronounced. Black men receive 3 strikes sentences at rates far exceeding their proportion of the population. The prior convictions that count as strikes often come from decades of over-policing in black communities, drug convictions from the crack epidemic era, when sentencing was explicitly racist in impact, if not intent. The third strike might be minor. The first 2 ensure that the minor offense becomes permanent incarceration. Cost analyses reveal the economic absurdity. Housing an inmate for life costs taxpayers well over $1 million. Elderly inmates, which 3 strikes laws guarantee in abundance, require expensive medical care. The deterrent effect, the supposed justification for these mandatory sentences, doesn't exist in any measurable form. Crime rates declined in states without 3 strikes at the same rates as states with them. The laws didn't prevent crime. They just ensured that prisons filled with geriatric populations serving life sentences for nonviolent offenses committed decades earlier. Some states have reformed their 3 strikes laws. California voters passed Proposition 36 in 2012, limiting life sentences to cases where the third strike is serious or violent. Thousands of people became eligible for resentencing. Many have been released and have not reoffended. The sky didn't fall. Public safety didn't collapse. The only thing that changed was that prison beds freed up and taxpayers stopped funding million-dollar sentences for shoplifting. But reform hasn't reached everywhere. Many states maintain their original 3-strike statutes. The logic remains the same. 3 crimes, regardless of nature or spacing or circumstances, equal permanent removal from society. The number's enough. The law doesn't distinguish between someone who committed 3 violent assaults and someone who shoplifted twice and then stole a bicycle. It can't. It was designed not to. The law didn't distinguish between violent predators and petty thieves. It didn't have to. The point wasn't justice. It was a number. And the number was enough. 3 strikes removes freedom. But before you even get to trial, another policy determines whether you wait for justice in a cell or at home. 16 policies. 16 legal nightmares. If you're exhausted, imagine living through them. Subscribe if these truths need wider circulation. Comment. Which policy should be first on the reform list? Or tag someone who still believes the system is fair. Sometimes facts are the best argument. 17. Cash bail system. 2 people are arrested for the same crime, same charges, same circumstances, same presumption of innocence. One walks out of the jail within hours. The other stays for months, loses their job, their apartment, their ability to prepare a defense. The difference isn't guilt or danger, it's a bank account. Welcome to the cash bail system, where freedom before trial is a luxury the poor can't afford. At any given moment, more than 500,000 people sit in jails across America awaiting trial. They haven't been convicted. they're presumed innocent, and they're detained purely because they can't afford the bail amount set by a judge who looked at charges, consulted a bail schedule, and assigned a number without considering whether the defendant could possibly pay it. Bail amounts are supposed to ensure court appearances. That's the theory. Set an amount high enough that defendants won't skip town and forfeit the money. But the amounts are calibrated to charges, not to individual circumstances or financial reality. A judge sets bail at $10,000. Someone with resources pays it, or pays a bail bondsman 10% of it, and walks free while awaiting trial. Someone without resources stays jailed, sometimes for months, sometimes for over a year, waiting for a trial date that keeps getting pushed back. The consequences of pretrial detention cascade. You lose your job because you can't show up for shifts. You lose your apartment because rent doesn't pay itself. Your car gets repossessed. Your children go to relatives or, worse, into the system. Your ability to help your attorney prepare a defense evaporates because you're behind bars with limited phone access and no ability to gather evidence, interview witnesses, or even dress yourself in clothes that don't scream defendant. The pressure to plead guilty becomes enormous. Prosecutors know this. They use it. Stay in jail for months awaiting trial, or plead guilty to a lesser charge and get sentenced to time served. Walk out today. The choice isn't really a choice. Most people take the plea even when they're innocent, even when they might win at trial, because freedom today beats the possibility of freedom months from now. Studies show that detained defendants are more likely to plead guilty, more likely to receive harsher sentences, and more likely to be convicted than people who make bail and await trial from outside. The bail bond industry profits from all of this. It's a multi-billion-dollar business built on poor people's desperation. Can't afford bail? A bondsman will pay it for you for a non-refundable fee of 10%. That fee is pure profit for the bondsman. The defendant never sees that money again, even if charges are dropped, even if they're acquitted, even if they show up for every court date as required. It's ransom, privatized and legalized. Some jurisdictions have begun reforms. New York eliminated cash bail for most misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. California attempted similar reforms, but faced pushback and revision. The argument against bail reform always centers on public safety, on the idea that without financial incentive, defendants will flee. But the data doesn't support this. Jurisdictions that have eliminated or reduced cash bail haven't seen spikes in failures to appear. They've seen jail populations decrease and people able to fight their cases without the devastating consequences of pretrial detention. What makes this system fundamentally unconstitutional, despite decades of court rulings saying otherwise, is the wealth discrimination at its core. Two people, identical circumstances, different outcomes, based solely on their ability to pay. That's not justice. That's not public safety. It's a price tag on presumption of innocence. Innocent until proven guilty unless you're poor. Then you're jailed until you can prove you're not. The presumption of innocence came with a price tag, and those who couldn't afford to pay it waited in cells, watching their lives dismantle while waiting for trials to determine guilt they were supposed to be presumed not to have. Adults jailed on wealth, not guilt. But at least they're adults. Children face something even more permanent: 18, juvenile life without parole. In most of the world, sentencing a teenager to die in prison is considered barbaric. In the United States, it's legal. Over 2,000 people are currently serving life without parole for crimes committed before they turned 18. Some were 14. Some were tried as adults and sentenced as adults, despite brains that wouldn't finish developing for another decade. The United States is one of only a handful of countries that allows sentencing juveniles to life without possibility of parole. Most nations ban the practice outright, recognizing that children, even children who commit serious crimes, are fundamentally different from adults in ways that matter for culpability and capacity for change. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, ratified by every country except the United States, explicitly prohibits life sentences without parole for juveniles. But American courts have been slower to reach that conclusion. For decades, prosecutors charged children as adults for serious offenses, and judges handed down sentences that guaranteed those children would never leave prison. The crimes were often terrible. Murder, usually. Sometimes robbery that resulted in death. Sometimes felony murder, where a juvenile participated in a crime during which someone died, even if the juvenile didn't pull the trigger. The victims deserve acknowledgement. The harm was real. But so is the science showing that 14-year-old brains are not adult brains, that adolescents process risk differently, that the parts of the brain responsible for impulse control and long-term thinking don't fully develop until the mid-20s. Neuroscience has been unambiguous about this. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and understanding consequences, isn't fully formed in teenagers. Adolescents are more susceptible to peer pressure, more likely to act impulsively, less able to consider long-term consequences. This isn't excuse-making, it's biology. And every major medical and psychological organization has acknowledged that children, even older teenagers, are meaningfully different from adults in ways that affect moral culpability. The Supreme Court has inched toward recognizing this. In 2005, Roper v. Simmons banned the death penalty for juveniles. In 2010, Graham v. Florida prohibited life without parole for juveniles convicted of non-homicide offenses. In 2012, Miller v. Alabama ruled that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional, requiring judges to consider age and circumstances. In 2016, Montgomery v. Louisiana made that ruling retroactive. But the practice continues. Miller didn't ban juvenile life without parole. It just made it non-mandatory, requiring individualized sentencing, hearings. Prosecutors still seek these sentences. Judges still impose them. And the 2,000-plus people currently serving them remain in prison with no possibility of release. No matter how much they've changed, no matter what they've accomplished inside, no matter how much evidence exists that they're no longer the children who committed those crimes decades ago. Racial disparities are severe. Black juveniles receive life without parole sentences at rates dramatically higher than white juveniles. The discretion that Miller introduced, the requirement for individualized consideration, hasn't eliminated the racial bias that pervades every level of the criminal justice system. It's just pushed it into sentencing hearings where prosecutors paint black children as irredeemable and judges agree. The people serving these sentences are now in their 30s, 40s, 50s. They've been in prison longer than they lived outside it. Some have earned degrees. Some have mentored younger inmates. Some have expressed remorse, worked through trauma, and demonstrated every possible marker of rehabilitation. None of it matters. The sentence is permanent. There's no parole board to convince, no review process, no mechanism for demonstrating that they've changed because the sentence was premised on the idea that they couldn't. The cruelty isn't subtle. Life without parole means dying in prison. It means watching your parents age through visiting room glass and then burying them from a cell. It means missing every milestone, every holiday, every moment of normal life. It means knowing that no amount of change, growth, or rehabilitation will ever result in freedom. Hope isn't deferred. It's eliminated entirely. The sentence said they could never change. Neuroscience said they were still changing when they committed the crime. The policy sided with punishment over possibility, with finality over the fundamental truth that children are not adults, and treating them as such doesn't serve justice. It just fills prisons with people serving death sentences under another name. While individual children are sentenced to permanence, the system itself is built on a different kind of permanence. Contracts that guarantee prisoners. 19. Private prison quotas. Most businesses worry about empty inventory, empty hotel rooms, empty airplane seats, empty warehouse space. Private prisons have the same concern, except their inventory is human beings. And rather than competing for customers, they've written contracts guaranteeing them. Occupancy quotas, typically 80 to 100%, mean states must keep prison beds filled or pay penalties for the empties, which creates a perverse incentive: fill the cells or pay the bill. 65% of private prison contracts include occupancy guarantee clauses. The language varies, but the mechanism is consistent. The state agrees to maintain a minimum population level in the facility. If the population drops below that threshold, the state pays anyway, compensating the company for revenue lost to empty beds. It's a business model that would make any other industry blush. Imagine if hospitals could charge for empty beds, or schools could bill for students who didn't enroll. The guarantees typically range from 80 to 100% capacity. A facility with 1,000 beds and a 90% guarantee must maintain 900 inmates. If the population drops to 800, the state owes payment for the 100 empty beds at the contracted per diem rate. The per diem rate, of course, is higher than what it costs to house inmates in state-run facilities. That's how privatization works, finding efficiencies that maximize profit while externalizing costs. CoreCivic and GEO Group, the two largest private prison companies in the United States, have perfected this model. They operate facilities across multiple states, each with its own occupancy guarantee. The contracts run for years, sometimes decades, locking governments into arrangements that penalize population reduction. And if a state successfully implements reforms that reduce incarceration, if crime drops and judges sentence fewer people to prison time, the state still pays the private company for cells it doesn't need. The incentive structure is dystopian. A state's interest in reducing incarceration collides directly with its contractual obligation to maintain prison populations. Every diversion program, every sentencing reform, every effort to reduce recidivism becomes a financial liability if it results in fewer bodies in private facilities. The companies don't have to lobby against criminal justice reform, though they do. The contracts themselves create pressure to maintain the status quo, and they lobby extensively. CoreCivic and GEO Group spend millions annually on lobbying at state and federal levels. They contribute to political campaigns. They fund research supporting tough-on-crime policies. They employ former lawmakers and corrections officials who understand how to navigate the system. The money flows toward politicians who support longer sentences, mandatory minimums, and immigration detention, all of which keep facilities full and profits steady. Arizona provides a stark example. In 2011, documents revealed that the American Legislative Exchange Council, funded partly by private prison companies, had drafted model legislation, including Arizona's harsh immigration law, SB 1070. The law increased detention of undocumented immigrants who ended up in private facilities. The companies that helped write the policy profited from its implementation. The revolving door between private prisons and government spun so fast, it generated its own momentum. Some states have moved to eliminate occupancy guarantees. Idaho, Nevada, and others have banned the practice or declined to renew contracts containing these clauses, but most states continue operating under the same model, bound by contracts signed years ago and renewed automatically unless someone bothers to fight the renewal. The companies have made it easy to keep the status quo. Just sign here. Don't worry about the population guarantee. We'll handle the rest. Empty beds were lost revenue. Full cells were quarterly earnings. And the math that prioritized profit over population reduction wasn't a glitch. It was the contract, signed and sealed, creating a system where reducing incarceration became financially punishable and maintaining maximum capacity became an economic imperative that no amount of talk about rehabilitation or reform could overcome. While private prisons profit from filled beds, State governments profit from filled cells in a different way, through phantom constituents. 20. Prison gerrymandering. Representation is supposed to be based on residents. People who live in a district, vote in that district, participate in that district's civic life. But the census counts incarcerated people as residents of the prison, not their home communities. Which means that rural counties hosting prisons gain political representation from people who can't vote, while urban communities that actually house these citizens lose political power. It's taxation without representation in reverse. The Census Bureau has counted prisoners at their place of incarceration since 1850. For most of that history, prison populations were small enough that the impact barely registered, but mass incarceration changed the math. With over 2 million people behind bars, many concentrated in rural facilities far from their home communities, the distortion became significant. Entire legislative districts now derive substantial portions of their population counts from prisons full of people who can't vote and have no connection to the surrounding community. The transfer of political power flows predictably. Prisoners are disproportionately from urban areas, disproportionately Black and Hispanic. Prisons are disproportionately located in rural areas, disproportionately white. Counting prisoners where they're incarcerated inflates the population of rural white districts while deflating urban minority districts. The result is a systematic transfer of political representation from cities to countryside, from communities of color to predominantly white areas. Some examples clarify the absurdity. A legislative district in upstate New York derived 60% of its population from prisoners. 60%. The district met population requirements for representation only because of inmates who couldn't vote for the representative. In Pennsylvania, commissioners in one county bragged that hosting a prison gave them greater influence in the state legislature. The prisoners were literally described as phantom constituents, bodies that count for apportionment, but not for actual representation. Funding formulas magnify the problem. Many state and federal programs allocate money based on population. More residents means more funding for infrastructure, schools, healthcare. Except the residents being counted are prisoners who don't use local schools, who receive healthcare through the prison system, who contribute nothing to the local tax base. The community hosting the prison gets federal dollars calculated on a population that includes inmates. The community those inmates came from loses both the political representation and the funding. For decades, this happened invisibly. The census counted prisoners at prisons. Legislative districts were drawn using that data. Nobody questioned the practice because nobody looked closely at where the population was coming from. Advocacy groups finally started mapping the numbers, showing exactly how prison gerrymandering distorted representation, and the picture that emerged was damning. Several states have passed reforms requiring prisoners to be counted at their home addresses for redistricting purposes. New York, Maryland, California, Nevada, others. The reforms correct the population counts used for drawing legislative maps while leaving the census data itself unchanged. It's a workaround, a state-level fix for a federal counting problem. Most states haven't bothered. The status quo benefits whoever controls redistricting, and those people are usually the beneficiaries of inflated rural populations. The Supreme Court has declined to intervene. Legal challenges arguing that prison gerrymandering violates equal protection or voting rights have failed. Courts treat it as a census methodology question, not a constitutional violation. The fact that it systematically advantages one political party over another, one racial group over another, doesn't rise to the level of legal remedy, apparently. The prisoners counted toward representation. They couldn't vote for representatives. And the district that gained a legislative seat from their presence never asked for their input, never considered their needs, never acknowledged them as anything more than numbers on a census form that justified another seat at the table where decisions got made about how to keep those prisons full. political representation manipulated by prisoner counts, educational opportunity manipulated by different calculations entirely. 21. Eliminating prison education programs. Education is the single most effective tool for reducing recidivism. It's not opinion. It's data. Replicated across decades of research, inmates who complete educational programs behind bars are 43% less likely to return, which makes the systematic elimination of prison education programs across the country not just short-sighted. It's self-sabotage. Expensive, intentional, politically popular self-sabotage. In 1982, more than 700 prison college programs operated across the United States, funded partly through Pell Grants that incarcerated students could access like any other low-income American pursuing higher education. Then came the 1990s, the peak of tough-on-crime politics, when being soft on criminals became political suicide and education in prison became reframed as coddling. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 eliminated Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated students. The justification was moralistic and financially nonsensical. Why should taxpayers fund college for criminals when law-abiding citizens struggle to afford tuition? The question ignored that Pell Grants go to low-income students generally, that education reduces recidivism dramatically, and that the cost of college courses is a fraction of the cost of reincarceration. But facts rarely survive contact with political soundbites. Prison college programs collapsed almost overnight. By 2000, fewer than a dozen remained. The funding disappeared. Faculty stopped teaching behind bars. Degrees became impossible to complete. Inmates who had been working toward educational goals found themselves with truncated transcripts and no path forward. States eliminated vocational training programs around the same time, cutting welding courses, automotive repair, computer skills, everything that might prepare someone for employment after release. The Rand Corporation studied this multiple times. Their research showed that every dollar spent on prison education saves $4 to $5 in reincarceration costs. The return on investment is extraordinary. But investments require thinking beyond the next election cycle, and criminal justice policy is notoriously short-term in focus. Some facilities maintained basic literacy programs and GED preparation. These are important, certainly, but they're not sufficient. A GED might get you an entry-level job. It won't get you the kind of stable employment that actually reduces the likelihood of returning to crime. College degrees, vocational certifications, skills training, these are the interventions that create pathways to stability. And they're the programs that got cut first and deepest. In 2020, Congress restored Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated students through a pilot program. It was celebrated as progress, treated as innovative reform, but it was just undoing damage that should never have been inflicted. The pilot is limited, covering only a fraction of inmates who might benefit. Waitlists at participating facilities stretch for years. Access remains constrained by security classifications, sentence length requirements, and facility discretion. Political opposition remains fierce. Every attempt to expand prison education programs triggers the same rhetoric. Criminals don't deserve college. They should be punished, not educated. The framing assumes punishment and education are mutually exclusive, as if learning somehow negates consequences. The framing ignores that recidivism punishes communities, that returning inmates without skills or education are far more likely to reoffend, that the cycle costs everyone except the people scoring political points by opposing reform. The data said, educate them. The politics said, punish them. And the revolving door kept spinning, powered by ignorance and policy masquerading as principle, guaranteeing that prisons would stay full of people who might have stayed out if someone had just let them take a class. Education denied in the name of punishment. Health care denied for reasons even more insidious. 22. Denying gender-affirming care. If you're diabetic in prison, you get insulin. It's medically necessary. If you're transgender and need hormone therapy, that necessity becomes debatable. Not medically debatable, every major medical association recognizes gender dysphoria as a serious condition requiring treatment, but administratively, politically, conveniently debatable, which is how courts end up deciding whether letting someone suffer is cruel or merely cost-effective. Most prison systems deny or severely restrict gender-affirming care. Hormone replacement therapy, the baseline treatment for gender dysphoria, is unavailable in many facilities. Surgery is denied almost universally. Transgender inmates are left to navigate their gender dysphoria without medical support in an environment already hostile to difference, already violent toward vulnerability. The justifications vary by jurisdiction, but share common themes. Cost primarily. Hormone therapy and surgical interventions are expensive, officials claim, and prisons can't afford to provide them. Security concerns follow close behind. Vague assertions that gender-affirming care somehow complicates housing assignments or creates unspecified risks. The arguments don't survive scrutiny. Hormone therapy costs less than many medications routinely provided. Security concerns are manufactured, unsupported by evidence. Many systems implement what's called a freeze-frame policy. If you were receiving hormone therapy before incarceration, the prison will continue it. If you weren't, they won't start. The policy creates arbitrary tiers of care, based not on medical need, but on timing. Someone arrested the day before their first hormone therapy appointment gets denied. Someone arrested the day after receives treatment. The medical necessity is identical. The access is not. The American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, every professional organization with expertise in transgender healthcare has stated clearly that gender dysphoria requires treatment, that denying treatment causes significant psychological harm, that hormone therapy and other interventions are medically necessary for many transgender individuals. Prison systems have looked at this consensus and decided that medical expertise is advisory, not binding. The harm is documented extensively. Transgender inmates denied gender-affirming care experience severe depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation at rates far exceeding the already elevated rates among transgender people generally. Self-harm increases. Suicide attempts increase. The denial of care doesn't just cause discomfort. It creates medical emergencies that prisons then have to manage at far greater cost than providing the denied care would have required in the first place. Litigation has achieved limited success. Some courts have ruled that denying hormone therapy to inmates already receiving it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Others have rejected claims entirely, finding no constitutional violation in withholding care. The Eighth Amendment challenges Founder on the deliberately indifferent standard, which requires proving that officials knew about serious medical need and consciously disregarded it. Prison systems avoid liability by claiming they don't consider gender dysphoria a serious medical need, despite the medical consensus saying otherwise. Transgender inmates face additional vulnerabilities beyond denied health care. Housing assignments that ignore gender identity place transgender women in men's facilities, where rates of sexual assault and violence are astronomically high. Protective custody, offered as a solution, often means solitary confinement, trading one form of harm for another. The system offers no good options, only degrees of suffering. Federal facilities moved slightly forward. In 2022, the Bureau of Prisons updated its policy to allow consideration of gender-affirming surgery on a case-by-case basis. The policy is progress on paper. In practice, approvals remain rare, processes are opaque, and most requests are denied with minimal explanation. The medical necessity was documented. The suffering was real, but the policy remained unchanged. Because acknowledging trans inmates as human first, prisoners second, required empathy the system hadn't budgeted for. Medical care became a debate rather than a right, and the people caught in that debate paid with their mental health, their safety, and sometimes their lives. While transgender inmates are denied health care, other vulnerable populations face denial of a different sort. The kind measured in hours, not hormones. 22 policies, 22 legal nightmares. If they do horrify you, subscribe. Share this. Make it impossible to ignore. Drop a comment. What's the most urgent reform? Or tell us if you've experienced these policies firsthand. Your stories matter. The system survives on silence. 23. Extreme heat and cold exposure. In Texas, where summer temperatures routinely exceed 100 degrees, most prisons don't have air conditioning. In Montana, where winter temperatures regularly drop below zero, heating is often inadequate. Prisoners die every year from heat stroke and hypothermia. Not in the wilderness, not by accident. In government facilities where climate control exists in offices and staff areas, but not in housing units. Because the Constitution, courts have ruled, doesn't guarantee comfort. There is no constitutional right to air conditioning. This is settled law, repeated in cases after case, where inmates have sued over unbearable heat. Judges acknowledge the suffering. They note the health risks. They express concern. And then they rule that discomfort, even deadly discomfort, doesn't rise to the level of cruel and unusual punishment. The Eighth Amendment protects against deliberate cruelty. Courts reason, not inadequate amenities. Texas operates the largest prison system without universal climate control. Over 70% of its facilities lack air conditioning in inmate housing areas. Summer temperatures inside cells regularly exceed 110 degrees. The heat index, accounting for humidity, can reach 120. People die. Not might die. Do die. Every summer, the death count includes inmates whose official cause of death lists heat-related illness. Vulnerable populations suffer disproportionately. Elderly inmates, people with cardiovascular disease, diabetics, anyone on medication that interferes with the body's ability to regulate temperature. The prison population skews older as long sentences, and life without parole become more common. The number of people physiologically incapable of surviving extreme heat grows while the facilities housing them remain unmodified. Northern states face the inverse problem. Heating systems in aging facilities fail or operate inadequately. Inmates sleep in cells where temperatures drop into the 40s. They're issued one thin blanket, maybe two if they're lucky. Hypothermia sets in. Fingers go numb. Illness spreads because bodies weakened by cold are more susceptible to infection. The infrastructure disparity reveals the priorities. Administrative offices have climate control. Staff break rooms have air conditioning and heat. Visiting areas maintain comfortable temperatures. But housing units, where inmates spend 23 hours a day in some cases, remain unmodified. The justification is cost. Retrofitting facilities with adequate climate control is expensive. The unspoken calculation is that inmate comfort doesn't justify the expense. Litigation has achieved minimal success. A few facilities have been court-ordered to install climate control after particularly egregious deaths or when plaintiffs can prove deliberate indifference to known risks. But most lawsuits fail. Courts defer to prison administrators on operational decisions. Climate control is characterized as a resource allocation question, not a constitutional right. The cost-benefit analysis, when anyone bothers to perform it honestly, favors installation. Emergency medical treatment for heat stroke costs thousands per incident. Wrongful death settlements cost more. The ongoing medical expenses for inmates suffering permanent damage from heat exposure accumulate over years. Installing air conditioning is a one-time capital expense with minimal operational costs. But budget cycles don't work that way. Capital improvements come from different funding streams than medical expenses. The incentive structure rewards deferring infrastructure investment, even when it would save money long term. Staff working in these facilities face the same temperatures technically, but they rotate shifts. They take breaks in climate-controlled areas. They go home. Inmates have none of these options. They're trapped in the heat or cold for months, for years, for decades. Their bodies adapt or break, often both. The heat wasn't punishment, officially. It was an amenity the state couldn't afford. And if inmates died waiting for the temperature to drop, well, comfort wasn't a constitutional right. Survival apparently was optional, at least according to courts that acknowledged the danger and ruled it acceptable anyway. Heat and cold kill slowly. Other policies kill in different ways, through neglect disguised as protocol. 24. Deliberate indifference to medical needs. To prove a prison violated your constitutional right to health care, you must demonstrate deliberate indifference, not negligence, not incompetence, not even gross negligence. Deliberate indifference, which means the prison staff must know you're seriously ill and consciously disregard that risk. Forgetting to give you medication? Not deliberate. Ignoring your chest pain because they're busy? Not indifferent. Watching you have a heart attack and deciding you're faking? Maybe. Maybe you have a case. The legal standard comes from Estelle versus Gamble, a 1976 Supreme Court case that established the framework for prison medical care claims. The court held that the Eighth Amendment requires prisons to provide adequate medical care, but defined adequate so narrowly that it protects almost nothing. Mere negligence doesn't count. Medical malpractice doesn't count. Even serious lapses in care don't necessarily rise to constitutional violations. The inmate must prove that officials subjectively knew about a serious medical need and deliberately chose to ignore it. The bar is absurdly high. An inmate with diabetes who doesn't receive insulin for days might not prevail if staff claim they forgot or misunderstood the urgency. An inmate with cancer whose treatment is delayed for months might lose if administrators can argue they were processing the request through proper channels. The standard requires proving what was in officials' minds, demonstrating not just that care was inadequate, but that the inadequacy was intentional and callous. People die from treatable conditions, while this standard protects the systems that let them die. Infections that antibiotics would cure spread unchecked. Appendicitis becomes peritonitis, becomes sepsis, because medical requests go unanswered. Heart disease, diabetes, cancer, conditions that are manageable with proper care, become death sentences behind bars where care is systematically delayed or denied. The stories accumulate like evidence nobody wants to examine. A diabetic inmate in Florida died after repeatedly telling guards his blood sugar was dangerously low. They thought he was faking. A man in Georgia died of dehydration and malnutrition after being denied water and adequate food for days. Staff claimed he was malingering. A woman in Texas died of cervical cancer that went untreated for over a year despite her repeated requests for medical attention. The facility said she didn't meet criteria for specialist referral. Privatized medical care makes everything worse. Companies like Corazon Health and WellPath contract with prisons to provide health care, and they operate on the same profit-maximizing principles as every other private prison contractor. Deny care when possible. Delay when denial isn't possible. Minimize costs. Inmates become cost centers to be managed, not patients to be treated. Staffing levels in prison medical units are chronically inadequate. Nurses and doctors who work in corrections often do so because they can't find employment elsewhere. Quality of care suffers. Record keeping is poor. Communication between shifts is inconsistent. Serious symptoms get missed or ignored, not out of malice necessarily, but out of the chaos of understaffed, underfunded medical operations operating in facilities designed for custody, not care. Even when inmates win lawsuits, the victories are narrow. A court might order a facility to provide a specific treatment to a specific inmate. The systemic problems continue. Other inmates with similar needs go untreated. The legal standard protects the system by requiring individualized proof in each case, making it nearly impossible to force broader reforms. The standard wasn't designed to protect inmates. It was designed to protect prisons from lawsuits. And it worked beautifully. Unless you were the one dying in the medical unit, waiting for someone to care enough to meet the legal threshold, watching your condition deteriorate while knowing that even death might not be enough to prove deliberate indifference if the autopsy showed that staff could plausibly claim ignorance, deliberate indifference to physical health. But the final policy is indifferent to something even more fundamental. Freedom itself, even after time is served. 25 endless probation and parole fees. You served your time. Every day of your sentence completed. Now you're out on probation, which sounds like freedom, but functions like extended punishment. Because probation isn't free. There are supervision fees, drug testing fees, electronic monitoring fees, program fees, administrative fees, fees that can total hundreds of dollars per month. And if you can't pay them, if the job you're struggling to get doesn't cover rent and probation fees and groceries, you go back to jail. Not for a new crime, for being poor. Probation and parole have become revenue-generating operations. What was once conceived as supervised reentry, a bridge between incarceration and full freedom, has transformed into a fee-based system that extracts money from people least able to pay. Monthly supervision fees run $50 to $80 in most jurisdictions. Drug testing adds another $50 to $100 monthly. Electronic monitoring, if required, can cost $300 or more per month. The costs accumulate faster than most people can earn. You can't refuse probation. When sentencing happens, the judge offers options: prison time or probation. Probation sounds better. It is better than being locked in a cell, but it comes with conditions, and those conditions all cost money. Attend substance abuse counseling, $80 per session. Complete anger management classes, $200 for the program. Submit to random drug tests, $20 each time. The supervision isn't supervision, it's billing. Private probation companies have made this worse. In states that allow it, probation supervision gets outsourced to for-profit companies that make their money from the fees they collect from probationers. The companies have financial incentive to keep people on probation longer, to require more programs, to find more violations. Every extended month is another month of supervision fees. Every mandated class is another revenue stream. The debt trap closes fast. Miss a payment? That's a probation violation. Get called in for a hearing. Maybe the judge gives you another chance. Maybe they don't. The violation goes on your record. Future employers see it. Future landlords see it. The opportunities that might allow you to pay the fees you owe disappear because you couldn't pay the fees in the first place. Technical violations, violations that aren't new crimes but are failures to comply with probation conditions, send tens of thousands of people back to prison every year. Can't pay your fees? Violation. Miss an appointment with your probation officer because you couldn't get off work? Violation. Fail a drug test? Violation. The conditions are numerous, sometimes contradictory, often impossible to meet, while also maintaining employment and housing. The cycle is explicit and intentional. Probation keeps people tied to the system. The fees keep them poor. The poverty makes compliance impossible. The failed compliance justifies reincarceration. And when they're released again, they're released back onto probation, back into the fee structure, back into the cycle that they never actually left. Some jurisdictions have moved away from fee-based probation recognizing the perverse incentives and the constitutional problems with jailing people for inability to pay. But most continue operating under the same model, treating probation as a profit center and probationers as customers who can be billed indefinitely. Length of probation extends the damage. A year of probation might be manageable. 3 to 5 years, common for felonies, becomes a sentence that outlasts the original jail time. 10 years of probation isn't unusual. That's a decade of monthly fees, a decade of restrictions, a decade of living under threat of reincarceration for administrative violations. The fees fund the system that imposes them. Probation departments use fee revenue to pay salaries, rent office space, purchase equipment. The worse someone does on probation, the more violations they rack up, the more court appearances they trigger, the more the system profits. There's no incentive to help people succeed when failure is more lucrative. The sentence ended. The debt didn't. And the freedom they'd promised at the end of their time was actually just a different kind of cage, one with fees attached, and an exit that kept moving further away with every missed payment, every technical violation, every month they couldn't afford to be free. The policy wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system, working exactly as designed, ensuring that punishment never actually ends, that the revolving door keeps spinning, and that freedom remains perpetually deferred behind the paywall nobody told you about when the judge pronounced sentence and you thought naively that serving your time meant it would be over.